My guest today is David O'Sullivan, so-called special envoy on sanctions. Next month, it will be 3 years since the European Commission, on behalf of the European Union, established the role of international special envoy for the implementation of EU sanctions on Russia. The reason, to put it bluntly, was Russia and continues to be Russia and its invasion of Ukraine. David, how are we doing?
Well, I think we are doing not too badly, but there is no room for complacency. My focus, as my title might imply or may not imply, because it's a rather complicated title, is mainly to do the external outreach to third countries who are not aligned with our sanctions, to discuss possible issues of circumvention that arise. So the issue of sanctions being avoided by working through jurisdictions who are not applying our sanctions. So I've spent a lot of time in the early stages reaching out to Central Asia, so Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, countries like Armenia and Georgia in the Caucasus, Turkey, Serbia, UAE. In the later stages, we also saw some issues rising in Southeast Asia because there were subsidiaries of European companies in Malaysia and in Thailand, and to a lesser extent in Vietnam, who were whose products were being exported via other jurisdictions. So this has been my focus. Now, you have to see sanctions as part of our total policy towards Ukraine. I think it's a mistake to imagine that sanctions alone are going to solve the problem. So we have the military assistance, we have the macroeconomic assistance, we have to a certain extent the humanitarian assistance, we have the political assistance, the perspective of membership of the European Union, but then we have sanctions. And we estimate that sanctions have in total, until now, deprived Russia of about 450 billion euros. I mean, their annual defense budget is about 120, 130 billion, so this is not a small amount of money. We also have been able to make much more complicated the supply of sophisticated technology to Russia. Russia is still getting some of this stuff, but they're paying perhaps 600% more than they would otherwise be paying. And of course, on the revenue side, while we have not had an embargo on Russian oil, we have reduced considerably the revenue going to Russia. Countries like Gazprom are in deep financial difficulty. And of course, the Russian economy as a whole is really struggling. I mean, all the key indicators of the Russian economy are flashing red. So I would say our sanctions are having an impact, even an important impact. So we need to maintain and continue that pressure, but they are not the whole story. We have to see the broader picture of our support for Ukraine and our pushback against Russia's unjustified aggression.
Mm-hmm. I agree, but if I take, you may have heard of a guy called Dmitry Nekrasov. Huh? He was a former advisor to Dmitry Medvedev at the time when the latter was not that loony. And then he later joined the Russian Opposition Council. And now he's working for a think tank. And he's been highly critical of the sanctions' real effect on the Russian economy, because he's basically saying that if, let's say, 15,000 individual measures were be decided or implemented, only 2,000 of them are really working as per they were intended. And one of the reasons he says is that we were naive in the beginning, that we were thinking that we are sanctioning and trying to influence a normal, quote unquote, market economy, which Russia is not.
Well, I don't, maybe some people thought that. I think most people who knew anything about Russia had no illusions. But I do feel that there has been a considerable impact on the Russian economy. But of course, what has happened, and this we have to acknowledge, is the complete transformation of the Russian economy into a war economy. So President Putin is basically cannibalizing the civil economy in favor of the war economy. So he has pumped state money into the war economy. This is depriving the civil economy of all the investment and the advances that it needs. So Russia will pay a very high price down the road for this, because they're losing competitiveness. They're not building the industries of the future. Everything is going into the war economy. We can see that the easy sources of public finance, so such as the sovereign welfare fund, which have been run down, almost depleted this year. We can see that industry has been forced to take bad loans to provide money for the war economy. So, of course, if you are a dictator like President Putin and you can completely dictate the terms of the economy without having to be responsible to anybody else, then you can do this. But it's not sustainable in the medium term. And I think this is where we have to put the emphasis, that this is, to a certain extent, Russia is defying the laws of economic gravity, and sooner or later, it's going to come crashing down. Now, unfortunately, it may be later rather than sooner. So I think we have to be prepared to be in this for the long haul. Putin's gamble is that we will lose interest, that we will get bored, or that we will be convinced that this is not working when it is working. But it's a long-term investment in damaging the Russian economy. It doesn't produce instant results.
Yeah. Well, there's Russian economy, and then there are Russians. And I read someplace that it has been quite surprising to what extent the war and subsequent sanctions have not affected the daily lives or the livelihood of the Russian people yet. But some say that there's also a huge difference in between people living in the major cities and metropolis and then the rest. You say in the medium term, maybe long term, this will start having a real impact on, but to give some sort of an idea, we in the West, we live in electoral cycles.
Yes.
Are we not talking about the next 4 years of an electoral cycle, or are we talking about something less? Did the sanctions that were hit now on the three major Russian energy players, could they be a turning point?
I am reluctant to give the impression that there is any one measure of sanctions that is somehow the killer blow, right? That this will end it. Because I think that is not to give people a realistic assessment of what we're trying to do and what we have to do. We are engaged in a medium-term struggle with Russia about who writes the rules of the 21st century in Europe. Is it the sort of rules-based, consensual respect for borders that we've tried to build in the European Union and allies in the West? Or is it might is right, and who has the biggest army and who has the biggest number of nuclear missiles? That's what this is fundamentally about. And I think that requires us to engage, to put pressure on Russia over the medium term. Now, if you ask me, ask an economist, when will Russia really experience an economic downturn? It depends on many factors. The price of oil, the international price of oil, is probably one of the most determining, to be quite honest with you. The more that falls, the more the revenue side is hit. But I think exactly as you say, since Putin doesn't face an electoral cycle, I think he can certainly keep this going for another year or two. I think at a certain moment, most people say the economic realities are going to kick in. And you've seen that Putin himself has admitted that they need to spend less on defense, that they're trying to have a sort of soft landing from the massive input of capital that went into the war economy, which is distorting the entire industrial production. But I think it's going to become more and more difficult to manage this in a balanced way, particularly as they run out of public finances. So you see they now have a deficit. Inflation is still running very high. The interest rate, it's come down from 21% to 17%, but let's face it, in most of our countries, 17% would produce a popular revolt. So I think, honestly, the point you have to bear in mind about sanctions is they are always leaky. Mm-hmm. They're always only partially effective. I mean, you can debate whether it's 90 or 80 or 70 or 60% effective, but they are effective and they have an impact. But they are not a quick fix to anything. They're simply a necessary accompaniment to everything else that we're doing.
Mm. Oil and gas, the main sources of traditional economy, they are a really important and interesting question, isn't it? A very complicated question as well. I mean, some argue that when you say the leakiness, one way to describe the leakiness is that there are EU countries, and not only the one or two that we like to blame, who by allowing and importing gas and oil from Russia actually are giving Russia more money than they ever had dreamt of to finance their war effort.
Oh, I don't think the statistics demonstrate that, really. I mean, I think the story of the last three years is the historic way in which the EU managed to wean itself off dependence on Russian energy. Mm-hmm. I think when the history books are written, people are literally going to say, how did that happen? Mm-hmm. We've eliminated coal. We cut oil by 90%. Okay, gas, LNG, which is a more liquid product, we cut from 45% to about 10-15%, and we're banning it now completely from the end of next year. I think the uncoupling of the European energy market from Russia is really a big story, and I think all member states deserve full credit. Now, are there exceptions? Have there been leakiness in that? Yes, we've had to grant exemptions to certain countries who felt they could not make the break immediately, and we're still dealing with some of that. We've come through now with Repower Europe with a proposal also, so we're ending the LNG by the end of next year, and we're ending, we plan to try and end the residual oil imports in the same time frame. But the amount of money going to that is far, far less than Russia ever got from us before. So, I mean, I think when you look at the macro numbers, I'm sorry, the story is how quickly we uncoupled from Russia, not how much we continue to do.
I agree that, of course, with your experience and with the benefit of hindsight also, it's true that the changes that have happened in our lifetime, in our careers, have been enormous. I'm thinking back to, say, 20 odd years ago when the 10 countries from the former Eastern Bloc joined the European Union. But also there is a similarity and analogy between those countries and some of the resistance that we still see. European unity is at the heart of this, and it's a work in progress, always will be. But do you think that this is not challenging EU to the limit, how fast things are changing and how fast we are asked to progress?
Well, the challenges we face go way beyond Russia, even if obviously the Russian aggression is one of the, if you have to list the sort of top 2 or 3 challenges we face, that's certainly one of them. Climate change remains a huge challenge, and this is also tied into the energy piece with Russia. I think one of the collateral benefits of the awful war in Ukraine has been a more rapid transition towards greener technologies, and this is something we should be doing anyway, irrespective of the situation with Russia and Ukraine. We have a competitiveness problem, which we know. So we have many challenges. We have the challenges of changing politics in the United States, where we have to kind of rethink a bit our transatlantic relationship. So all of this is ongoing. I think that, as always, Europe makes most progress in the face of challenges. And I think that was true of the pandemic. I think that is true of the Ukraine conflict. Or I'm sorry, I hate using the word Ukraine conflict because it's a Russian aggression, but you know what I mean. So the EU has stepped up and has demonstrated a huge capacity. We're now looking at defense, which is, of course, primarily a NATO military problem, but where the EU has an important role to play, particularly on the sort of the link between defense and industrial policy, because we have to have procurement, we have to try and reduce the number of weapon systems that we have, all of these things that are well known. These challenges are huge. How we adapt our system to face new threats. And every time when you look at it, you end up saying, the answer is more European cooperation. And so I think that will continue to be the situation.
It's an interesting question because the effectiveness of the EU sanctions regime has been based on, say, consensus, if not unanimity, to a large extent. And there is a very distinct difference between the two in your world, I'm sure. Sometimes when nowadays everybody talks about geopolitics because of Russia, geopolitics because of China, geopolitics because of the election of President Trump, they think that part of the feature of that geopolitics is that if you are in Finland, faced with more than 1,000, almost 2,000 kilometers of border with Russia, this threat is very eminent, very clear, and what we should be doing is very clear. Further away you move from the threats, less convinced you are.
Yes.
Less convinced you are.
Yes. Look,
should there be fundamental changes to the EU sanctions regime so that the political will, like the United States, could eventually have its day?
Well, I don't, if I look at the sort of, when I just look at the discussions in the Council between the member states, it's not those who are furthest away from the Russian border that are necessarily the most difficult. So I don't think that those two things go together. But you're absolutely right. Countries which, such as Finland, which has a horrific historic experience of Russia, and you fought 2 wars with them, or at least, one war in 2 phases. Obviously, you are much more, you are much more sensitive to these issues than, say, my own country of Ireland, which is at the outer western tip. But frankly, even Ireland cannot be indifferent to this because we have Russian ships mapping the cables, the undersea cables. We have Russian planes overflying our territory. We've had cyber attacks on our healthcare system, for example. So I think there is a growing recognition that this is a common threat and that we have to react together. So, of course, every country has to deal with its domestic politics, and that is tricky because not every country perceives the situation in exactly the same way. But once again, I continue to be amazed by the degree of unity we managed to put together, and the story about the sanctions. To be very honest, I was ambassador in Washington from 2014 to 2019, and I had been able to say then to my American critics, and there were many critics of Europe because of Nord Stream 2 and because of lack of armaments for Ukraine and so forth, if I'd been able to say we could have put the type of sanctions that we have now on Russia, and we could do that by unanimity and maintain it and intensify it over 3 years, always deciding by unanimity, nobody would have believed me.
Yeah.
So I think, once again, glass half empty, glass half full. I prefer to see what we have done as a remarkable achievement.
Yeah.
We need to do more, I agree, but
do you see it's possible that there is some sort of systemic change in the horizon? You mentioned the United States. Now, for family reasons, I'm spending quite a lot of time in Arizona.
Okay.
Tucson, Arizona. My eldest daughter set up a family in there.
Okay.
So 3-4 months a year, I look at the world from that perspective.
There are worse places to spend a few months.
There are definitely worse places to spend time on. But nevertheless, I can tell you that from that perspective, the war in Ukraine, or Ukraine for that matter, let alone Europe, are rather far and distant. However, in a way, they are not given the voice in deciding, because in the United States, the president has the constitutional authority to decide on an executive order, and then they have an office a few steps down who decides how practically to implement that. That makes them more efficient, no?
Of course.
Is that, or are there steps without changing the European constitution that nobody wants to touch on? Are there steps that could be taken so that the Commission politics could be more almighty in enforcement?
Well, I mean, as you can imagine, this is something that I think about a lot. The first thing I would say is that for me, and this is my personal view, but I hold it very strongly, we need to move to decide sanctions by qualified majority. This is foreseen in the treaty. It is a possibility. Of course, you need unanimous agreement to decide by qualified majority, but I really believe that is something we should do, because I think unanimity, particularly in the area of sanctions, is very counterproductive, and we all know that when we use qualified majority, we don't outvote countries who have a real national problem that needs delicate treatment, but it just puts everyone in the mood of negotiating and being willing to get to an answer rather than feeling they can just block by saying no. So I think, notwithstanding that we have achieved so much with unanimity, I think we could do much better with qualified majority. On the implementation, look, the implementation is at national level for very good reasons, because this, in the first instance, concerns customs authorities, it concerns economics ministries, finance ministries, it concerns police, investigative services, prosecutorial services. None of this can you take to the European level, right? I mean, we cannot, we don't have an FBI, we don't have a CIA, and we don't have the sort of Europe. I mean, we have a European legal order, but it is still firmly rooted in our national systems. So I think the idea of putting implementation in Brussels would require so many dramatic changes that it's just unrealistic. What I think is realistic, and what I hope we can think about doing, would be to have a one-stop shop for everything that concerns exemptions, derogations, licenses, permissions, because that is currently delegated to each member state. And if you are a company operating in several member states, you have to apply to 3 or 4 or 5 national authorities. You get some people reply quickly, some take a bit longer, some say yes, some say no. It's very confusing for companies. So I think we need to think about some way in which, when we have our basic laws, which are then applied by the member states, but we need exemptions and derogations or permissions or licenses, that we should find a way of delivering at the European level for something that works across the 27.
What's your view on Russian frozen assets? I mean, it's not directly related to the sanctions regime, but it's certainly a sanction of a kind, of course. And the inability of the Council to reach a unanimity or consensus on using them to support and maybe reconstruct Ukraine.
Well, we don't have the inability. We're in the process of reaching agreement, so we haven't got there yet. But
yeah, I agree. I mean, it's an ingenious solution that is on offer, but it raises a different question. It's a question of maybe morality of it. I mean, notwithstanding whether this is right or wrong now, and I think everybody would agree that it's right because of the aggression and severity of it. But what about Israel and Palestine? If there were a UN-level decision that what is happening and being done in Gaza is about killing people.
Well, which it certainly is about killing people. I mean,
but Israel has a lot of assets in EU member states.
Yes, but we don't have a UN decision on Israel, right? As we don't have a UN decision on Russia. And so the responsibility falls to us in Europe. And in relation to Russia, where, frankly, there is clear aggression against not only against Ukraine, but against all of Europe. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is, I absolutely understand that people are very concerned about Gaza and what is happening, and it's horrific. But it is at one remove from us. Ukraine is not at one remove from us, and Russia is not at one remove from us, as we've just discussed. You have a border with them, yes. and you've joined NATO as a response to that. So I think we have a particular responsibility in this regard. Now, with regard to the assets, we immobilized these assets so that Russia could not access them to finance the war. We have not appropriated them. We have not seized them. What we are saying is that if Russia is not willing to pay for reparations, and let's face it, Russia is deliberately damaging massive amounts of civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, whether that's energy infrastructure, roads, apartment blocks, everything. The cost of reconstruction from the damage created by Russia is going to be massive. If Russia is not willing to participate in that reconstruction and to pay its fair share of the damage for the damage it has caused, then I think Ukraine can legitimately have a claim on those assets and say, well, actually, we should get that money if Russia's not prepared to pay. So that's what we're saying. So what we're saying is we will give Ukraine, in the meantime, a loan based on those assets, which Ukraine will only have to pay back if Russia pays reparations. If Russia doesn't pay reparations, then effectively that money passes to Ukraine in compensation for what Russia has not done. So I think in moral terms, this is perfectly acceptable.
Yeah.
I mean, be wary of making comparisons with other situations around the world. Look at what's happening in Darfur. How many thousands of people killed just recently? There was a massive civilian. I mean, we are faced with horrible situations all around the world. Europe can't solve all of those problems, right?
No.
But we do have to solve the problems on our own doorstep that are an immediate threat to our peace and security.
Well, we can't solve them, but across the Atlantic, there's somebody who tries to solve them in a matter of months, if not a couple of years. President Trump, that is. Now, what would you say about the cooperation between the United States and the EU when it comes to sanctions? Are we lockstep, or are we uncoordinated, or is it simply unpredictable because you don't know what the White House does from one day to the next?
Well, there's always an element of unpredictability. Let's be clear, and I think President Trump has made clear that he puts a priority on trying to broker a peace, and that is why he has reached out on numerous occasions to President Putin and tried to find various formulae to bring a ceasefire and peace negotiations. These have not been successful. Some of us in Europe would say no great surprise there, right? We might have anticipated that President Putin would not be easily won over to the idea of peace and a ceasefire. I think the U.S. has not lifted any sanctions. They have not changed their sanctions policy, so it has been steady as you go since the new administration is there. But neither has there been a great indication of willingness to do more. Now, we had a change last week with the sanctioning of Rosneft and Lukoil. Is this a shift, a permanent shift in policy, or is it a one-off to test how President Putin reacts to a toughening of the sanctions? I honestly don't know. In the meantime, we continue to have very good work at the technical level with our U.S. colleagues, but it's always subject to the president's decision, and he clearly is keen to promote the idea of negotiation rather than toughening of sanctions just at the moment. So that's why we've had these additional sanctions, but I don't know if that represents a shift in policy.
But sometimes when I think about this difference between the two, it's like I'm thinking about somebody in the White House, like an ancient Greek god with a big hammer in his hand. And he not only yields that hammer, but he says, when I hit the ground, everybody must follow. The secondary effect and all that sort of stuff. Whereas here we are bound by the rule of law, in good and in bad. So take Lukoil, for example, a big company that owns a number of affiliates under different names in different member states. Here they operate under the name of Lukoil, right? But it's owned by Belgian entities, etc., etc. In Finland, under a different name of Deboil. And it seems to be on the level of implementation of that decision. The European Union has not decided to sanction Lukoil in the same effect. That's the US question. Will it? Should it? And secondly is that when it comes to the impact of the US sanctions, some countries like mine seem to have acted more or less immediately with a view to trying to implement the intention of those sanctions without waiting for detailed instructions from you, Brussels.
Well, because we haven't taken a European decision. We are responding to a decision by the United States, and it is up to each member state to assess how that impacts their domestic situation with regard to any of the entities concerned. Germany, for example, had, quite a lot of, they had taken over, I think it was the Rosneft, they had basically created a sort of Chinese wall or a firewall between the activities in Germany of that company and the money that could go to Moscow. So no money is going to Moscow, and they are now, I think they've just got from the Americans a license to continue that situation. So this was a domestic German situation. You have a situation in Finland. My understanding is that the government hasn't done anything. My understanding is it's a private company has decided that they don't want to run the risk of appearing to be continuing to work with Lukoil in a way that might damage their other relations. The legal situation here in Belgium is different again. And this, inevitably, we just have to accept this. We have 27 legal orders, and each of them has to respect their own legal logic. And it's all justiciable. You can end up in court. So every member state has to move with a degree of caution of only doing this in a way that is legally sound. And I think that will inevitably produce some differences of interpretation across the 27.
Yeah, and I agree that a huge majority of people, to the extent that they would be able to make the link between the two, certainly would agree with you that we don't even want to have an American FBI or the American Immigration Authority on our streets, or European Immigration Authority on the United States. But still, there is a question of the hammer as a deterrent. If you do business with those guys, which we have just sanctioned, we will take business away from you. There is a thing to be said for that.
But it is happening.
Power.
I mean, one of the things that we had a meeting of member states here last week, and one of the things that struck me was the extent to which they are all now beginning to see coming into court a lot of prosecution, the results of investigations they started 2 or 3 years ago. And we're seeing increasing prosecutions and convictions across all our member states. So, I mean, we are implementing the sanctions.
Yeah.
People are going to jail. People are being fined. Yeah. So I think, once again, you know, it's always, the American story is always a bit simplistic, right? Because it's a unitary state. Mm-hmm. So it sort of sounds, the president decides and everything happens. Here, the council decides and then 27 countries have to implement it. So it looks less dramatic. But when you actually dig a bit underneath and you see what's happening, it's the same. We are prosecuting people who are breaking sanctions, who are not respecting the sanctions, who are circumventing sanctions. We have, all the member states have introduced unprecedented legal measures to protect the effectiveness of the sanctions. Breaking sanctions is a European crime, and we just adopted this year in May, we implemented a directive harmonizing the penalties. So once again, respectfully, I think you know, the story is more glass half full than glass half empty. I think when you look at what we have done in the last 3 years, it is very impressive. Now, is it enough? Because I've never had a job where I'm conscious that I wake up every morning to see how many people were killed in Ukraine. You and I have worked together in the European institutions. All of this was a little theoretical. It was about economic policy or about trade policy, but it didn't really affect people's life and death. And yet,
it feels really real now.
Yeah, and this, unfortunately, therefore, I always feel that what we're doing is inadequate. Yeah. It can never be enough because there are women and children and soldiers dying at the front, and that puts a huge responsibility on us.
Absolutely. I'd like to close with 2 questions. One is about evasion, right? And the second about the long-term, really long-term consequences of what is happening now. The question of evasion can be it can be about many things, but I would like to put the question about the shadow fleet, which seems to be one of the most ingenious and creative ways of avoiding the impact of sanctions that Russians have. What means do we have to kind of plug that hole?
Well, I mean, I think it would be a mistake to give Russia the credit for the shadow fleet. The Iranians invented the shadow fleet, actually. They were doing it already back in 2012. So they're the ones who first came up with this idea that you sort of use old vessels which are sort of off the radar screen, not part of the normal legitimate transport of petrol or of diesel fuel on the high seas. The Russians have, of course, taken it to new levels now because the scale is completely different. I think that we have largely got a handle on it. We have now sanctioned nearly 550 vessels. We can see that these vessels most of the time stop carrying Russian oil or carry much less oil. We have persuaded many of the flag states to deregister vessels who are sanctioned, and most of them are now complying with that. We've also persuaded a number of countries to not allow sanctioned vessels into their ports. So I think we have had a considerable impact. Of course, it does raise questions, and this is particularly pertinent for your listeners in the Baltic Sea. I mean, we do have issues of the environmental danger, of the danger of disrupting cables or sabotage. I mean, this is probably not happening that much, but it has. There have been incidents, and in Finland, you've already experienced that. So I think we are also working with the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, to get more international agreement on what can be done, what are the rights of coastal states to challenge vessels passing through their waters. You will be familiar, and I'm sure your people in Finland are very familiar with the debate about the United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea and the right of innocent passage, and what are the limits of that. We, of course, don't want to do things in our waters that might create bad precedents for our ships going through the Straits of Malacca or the Strait of Hormuz. So we have to be a bit careful. But I think there is a growing awareness that, this is something we're increasingly getting a handle on. And I think we have been effective in curbing Russia's ability to use the shadow fleet.
Okay, to close then, the war has been now ongoing for 3 years, right? As I said, there are sanctions upon sanctions upon sanctions, and some of them are very effective, some of them are starting to bite. Whether it's midterm or long term is going to have a rather lasting impact on Russian economy, but also on European economies, the transformation effect. Now, how long-standing? Even if the war were to end today, is there a return to the world that was in our lifetime?
I personally, I don't think so. I mean, I think there are, three things. Well, I would actually say five. There are five things that are changing significantly the international environment in which Europe has to operate. The first, obviously, is Russian aggression. And not only Russian aggression in Ukraine with the full-scale invasion and the horrible war that is being conducted there, but the buildup of the Russian military, the hybrid attacks, the drones. I mean, we can see that Russia's ambition is, apart from a degree of expansionism in its immediate neighborhood, it's also to destabilize our democracies, to weaken the ability of what I will call the West. It's not the West, I mean it because it's Central Europe, Eastern Europe, but you know what I mean by the bits west of Russia, to destabilize our democracies, to make us weaker, and to give Russia a bigger influence over the whole thing. We have a dramatic change in America, and I think the election of President Trump is, for the second time, does signal a long-term shift in America's role internationally. I mean, we may have somebody else there in 2028, but the likelihood is that the basic policies are not going to change that much. We have China, which is also changing dramatically the international environment. We now see with the Chinese export controls on rare earths, our vulnerabilities there. Mm-hmm. We have climate change, and we should not forget that that's still coming at us. And we have, let's be honest, the dramatic technological changes of AI, where we are way behind, right? Let's be honest. We've a long way to catch up on that. So this is the changing international environment. And once again, as a committed European official, I still think that the only answer for us in this small continent, and we're tiny when you look at us on the globe. I was with the commission in Tokyo for 4 years, the beginning of the 1980s. I used to go to schools, and a Japanese map, which they would always have on the wall, has the Pacific at the center, and Europe is off to the left. And they would say, where was I from? And I would say I was from Ireland. And then they would say, where is it on the map? And it was always under the frame of the map, right? It didn't even figure. It was up in the top left-hand corner. That gives you some sense of what our place in this world is. And we've played an outsized role until now. Maybe it's going to diminish, but if we want to continue to have any influence, then it is only by doing it together.
That's true. Thank you. It's been very useful.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.